All right, so hello and welcome everyone to this third webinar in this CGHE webinar series. The topic for today's presentation or webinar is exploring the outcomes of educating scientists and engineers. So that's the series, and the webinar for today is focused on professional expectations and personal motivations for science and engineering graduates as they reflect on their role in the society. The presenters that we have, or the speakers that we have for today, are Nicole Peterson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Engineering Education at Virginia Tech, and Ala Abdallah, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Philosophy and Ethics group at Eindhoven University of Technology. Ala used to be a graduate student, a PhD student at Virginia Tech while doing this project, and she is still a member of the project team, which is great. So I'm very excited to have both of you here. Good to see both of you, and looking forward to the webinar. But before we jump onto the webinar, a quick sort of housekeeping stuff. So the first point is that this webinar is being recorded. The Zoom link will be made available on the ResearchGate website, the link for which is on the slide. And as the webinar is going on, please keep yourself muted unless you're asked to speak, so that we don't have a lot of disturbance. You can turn on your video if you would like. It's not necessary, but always nice to have people see faces. Please do select speaker view in the top right-hand corner so that you are not looking at everyone else's screen, but just the speaker. And then finally, if you have questions for the speakers, please ask your questions in the chat. You can do it as the speakers are presenting, although the time for questions and answers is toward the end in the last 30 minutes. But you can send me your questions in the chat, and I will ask you to speak out your question when the session gets over, or when the speakers have finished their conversation. It's better to send me your questions sooner than later, because I will give opportunity to people to ask questions in the order in which I receive questions. So that being said, I don't want to take too much of time away from speakers. So over to you, Nicole and Ala.
Thank you, Ashish. We'll get the slides
thank you,
shared
Ashish.
shortly.
You have to stop sharing. Perfect. All right, Talal, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today, and thank you, Ashish, for the introduction. As Ashish mentioned, today's webinar would focus on graduates' professional expectations and personal motivations from engineering and science graduates. Myself, Ala, and fun fact, Nicole was my PhD advisor when I was working on this project. So before we delve in the findings from today, we would like to give you an overview of the project. And in case you have attended some other webinars from this series, would like to give you a reminder of what the project is. So we were looking at the graduate experiences of graduate experiences of employability and knowledge, and that project ran for 3 years, and it's part of a larger longitudinal study that ran for 7 years, where we worked with chemistry and chemical engineering students. Our team spans 3 different countries, the UK, South Africa, and the US. I would like to shout out to all the team members. I think some of them are with us today on the call. And during that project, we tracked the students from the time they started their undergraduate degrees till the time they graduated. And then we followed them after graduation. And we did that with 12 different departments. So in each country, we had 2 different universities. And with each university, we worked with the chemistry department and the chemical engineering department. Another part of an overview of the project is the protocol design that we have, or the so we had semi-structured interviews, and the interview ran for about an hour. And for today's specific topic, these were the questions that we focused on, or the answers from the graduates that correspond to these questions were what we focused on. So we focused on things like what were the most important things that the students viewed that they gained from studying either chemistry or chemical engineering, what they hope to gain from the university, and the changes people, and how all of that potentially related to their role in society and social responsibility. And the way we'll do today's talk, we start with focusing on the engineering graduates, and then I will hand it over to Nicole to discuss the chemistry graduates. So an overview of the engineering programs that we looked at in England, it took the students about 3 to 4 years to finish, on average, to finish their degree. And they had the option to opt in an accelerated master's that would add on another year. Some of them chose to do an industry placement. And similar, so in South Africa and the US, it took the students on average a year longer, from 4 to 5 years. And they also had the options to do an internship or a co-op, which is similar to the idea of an industry placement. Once the students graduated, we looked into the trajectories of where they ended up, and some of our graduates continued their studies. So they went to grad school for a PhD or a master's in a variety of fields. Some graduates did stick with what you would traditionally think of as chemical engineering, so like process engineering, but we also have graduates who went into medical school, did nuclear engineering, data science, computer science. And a similar trend was also for those who went to industry or took on a full-time job. Some of them did typical chemical engineering jobs like being a process engineer, but also we have graduates who went on a variety of sectors like being a consultant, working in the energy sector. So this is just to give you the background of the data we're about to discuss, and the graduates, they are all on the different journeys in their career and different fields. So some of the themes we start seeing with the engineering graduates is that they discuss this idea of developing transferable skills and the engineering mindset after they graduated. And that enabled them to develop some transferable skills like time management and being committed and hardworking. And they also talked about an engineering mindset, which is related to being able to solve problems. So some of the graduates talked about viewing that there's a solution to every problem. And some of them extended that mentality to not only solve problems in their jobs, but even in their personal lives. And while those skills are very important, and one of the outputs or one of the goals for graduating engineers, the graduates did not necessarily draw a connection between their ability to solve problems and trying to address societal problems or bigger problems beyond the work, like, for example, climate change. They talked about these skills and mindsets mainly in the context of work. And here we see some examples from graduates. So Lucas, for example, who now is doing, or at the time of the interview, is doing a PhD in material science, talked about the distinctiveness of the engineering degree from his perspective, and how it's very specific to creating or giving their students this idea of, or this mentality of being able to solve problems in everyday lives. And similarly, Nina also, who is graduated from South Africa, talked about some of the transferable skills that she harnessed through her degree. Another theme that came up with the engineering graduates is them moving away from the idea of talking about specific parts of their disciplinary knowledge, and then addressing chemical engineering as a field in a much general and broader sense. Along with that came their they started developing what it's like to be an engineer or an engineer identity, whereas when they were undergraduate students, from the data, we saw that they typically thought of themselves as an engineering student. So we see the shift in identity from being a student to being a professional. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also with that comes the understanding of the field or understanding of the discipline as a whole. And we also had a very interesting case where one of our graduates ended up finishing engineering, and then she's now, or the time of the interview, doing medicine, and she was contrasting the discipline of engineering to the discipline of medicine. And from her perspective, it was very hard for her as an engineer to understand or relate to her social responsibility, because she is removed or far away from the consequences of the field, whereas in being a medical student, she can see on daily basis that if she does something wrong, it could hurt someone, whereas in engineering, she didn't really think about it that way. So while the graduates developed new identities and developed a new understanding of the field, with the exception of the medical students, we don't see a much connection between that and, again, the further developing of social responsibility. And this is just another example of, so Laith, who graduated from Erbium, he made the connection that having a bigger understanding of chemical engineering and chemical processes allows him to understand some of the public discourse about sustainability, but without necessarily himself doing something about sustainability in his work. This is the last theme we'll discuss for the engineering graduates, is this connection between personal identities of the graduates and their university experience, and in some cases, if that relates to the social responsibility. So the graduates talked about how they feel or they reflect that they are more confident, they are more social and independent as a result of the university experience, due to socialization factors like being in a student society or moving away from home. And some of the graduates connected or tried to connect between their personal identity and trying to help others to have a similarly positive experience, especially if there were connections to diversity, if they're from a minority or they are women. They felt that they face some challenges, and they want to make sure that others who are from a similar background have a better experience. So in a way that touches upon social responsibility, but more on a personal level, like how can I help one other person have a good experience. But overall, a lot of the graduates saw that the university helped them shape whom they want to be. And an example of that, we have Annie, who graduated from Oregon, so from the US. She talks about how she wants to promote that others can do engineering too. And from her undergraduate interviews, we know that Annie talked about having difficulty in not seeing a lot of faculty, women faculty in her program. And we also know that due to a relationship with a mentor she had, that pushed her to switch into nuclear engineering. So that mentor relationship was very important for her, and hence she wants to be that for someone else. And with that, I conclude some of the things we saw in the engineering data. So a lot of the graduates, we see them talking about transferable skills and talking about engineering way of thinking, having an appreciation of engineering knowledge and how they are facilitating some of that in their careers. We also see that the graduates started developing an engineer identity and moving away from the student identity. But by this point, at least by this point of us conducting the interviews, we don't see explicit parallels between the graduate's profession and issues behind it, or them developing a strong sense of their role in society. And with that, I hand it over to Nicole with the chemistry graduates.
Thank you. Thank you, Ola. So I will walk you through some of the main points we saw with the chemistry graduates at this time. The programs are similar, as you would imagine them being the same universities. But what we saw different in terms of their trajectories after graduation, we saw some graduates, going into masters and PhDs, mostly in chemistry, medical, and there were the occasional ones that went to chemical engineering for their masters or PhDs. We also saw similar graduates go into national labs, pharmaceutical companies, and then we added a different category for the chemistry grads because we saw some secondary school or high school teachers in our graduates. So one of the main points that came up across all the graduates was talking about how a career in chemistry is more than technical knowledge. So we saw the graduates starting to talk about how they were seeing the day-to-day value of the traditional technical skills, but like Allah mentioned, they talked about other skills that were required, skills such as being able to communicate across different professions, so being able to communicate not just with other scientists or other chemists, but people who worked in different departments or with different technical knowledge. They talked about how they were able to apply their robust employability skills to everyday issues. So how they were seeing chemistry, when they would talk to someone about water quality, or how they would see chemistry when they would talk to someone about food. And that also tied into this concept of being able to look beyond their own disciplinary focus to see the wider landscape in which their discipline was operating or their profession was operating, how it showed up in their everyday lives, in their relationships with their friends or even their family. And then we also saw them talking about beyond my job or beyond my career, I want to be able to find a place in the world, being able to connect with people, building relationships. Some of these, when we looked across the 7 years of a particular participant, we would see that these were some of the themes that they talked about over the 7 years. So it was hardly surprising that they would carry forth these things into their career or their professions. So for example, here we see Harold, who graduated from Europeum, and he is now working as a quality control analyst, talking about how he was able to use the skills to work on diagnostic testing for things like COVID, being able to understand what results he was seeing and what it meant for the person, whether the person was negative or positive, but then also being able to use the skills of chemistry to make a difference in his community. Selma, who graduated from Sodium and is now pursuing a master's degree at Sodium, talked about how wanting to, at first, she wanted the degree to make something of herself. Not to say that if you don't go to university, you don't make something of yourself, but also looking at how, as a food scientist, now she was out there trying to educate people about different, how they can read labels on different food products, knowing what is good, what's not, things they should be consuming or not. But seeing this interplay here about, I have this technical knowledge, I have this career I'm building, but I'm also being able to apply it to different situations. Another theme we saw among the graduates was how they were using their scientific knowledge while also continuing to develop personal transferable skills that they might have started to engage in at university, but now that they were in a different setting, being able to not only have a good foundation of chemistry knowledge that they can apply, but as they were developing scientific literacy and how they engage with research papers or products, or how they even are able to communicate these things in common everyday language to the people around them. They were also learning how to better manage their stress levels, how to meet deadlines, their time, what they choose to prioritize, such as they talked about building these relationships or just finding other things to do outside of their everyday job. But overall, through these different activities, they were developing confidence in their abilities, not just their technical abilities, but also personal abilities. So Mason, who graduated from Sodium, took a gap year and now was back at Sodium pursuing another degree. He talked about how, other than the degree itself, now he was having a different view of university, having gone away for a bit worked as a teacher, I think, and then was now back in a degree program, that he was seeing how their friendship and experiences, so you're getting the knowledge and skills, how to be a critical thinker, but you are also learning life skills while at university and on campus. And now that you're off campus, how these skills are helping him to navigate just the world. This third theme here came up, I would say, in some contexts more than others, but we saw evidence of it across all the grads. It was more prominent in the English context, I would say, and the South Africa context. And so it was where we saw graduates talking about how they use their degree to educate others, but also being able to work hard at their jobs and being taken seriously. So having this degree for them was more of a personal fulfillment, demonstrating that not only could they learn a very hard subject, but that they overcame their fear, and now they have the degree as a testament to the fact that they were really able to do it. So then being able to have this degree, that idea of personal accomplishment, if you will, now they felt as though they could make any career move. So while they may not stay in their current jobs as a quality control analyst, they now know that they have the requisite qualifications and skills that they're developing to be able to be successful anywhere. Denise was one of the grads that across the 7 years of her interview, every year when asked what she hoped to gain, she was like, I want this degree. I was told I couldn't get it. I never thought I could get it. And now I have this degree, and it's just all, it was really what I went to university for. And that if it's anything, I look back on my whole experience, it really means a lot to me that I went and I got this degree, because she says I wasn't to go and get a degree, and that's what I did. She was also older than some of her peers. So in the interview, she also talked about, I'm sure there were other things there I could have done, like make friends, meet people, but they don't have life experiences. And so because she was older and her motivation was different, for her, it was just like, let me get this degree and I'll figure out the rest as I go. So what are some of the broad conclusions we saw from the chemistry data? So holistically across all the graduates was a view of how they have been using, and even their futuristic thoughts about how they can further use the knowledge that they gained from studying chemistry from the different industries or different sectors in which they work. We also saw them taking a more active role in what they learned. So now that they had the core understanding of a chemistry degree, developing skills or learning new knowledge that was specific for the roles they have. So they talked about how there were other concepts they were learning on the job as they go. And the ones that were in the PhD program talked about how now they were becoming more focused in a particular area, as opposed to having to learn everything as they would have in their undergrad degrees. They talked about the personal gain. So outside of pursuing the degrees, a lot of the participants talked about prioritizing self-care, like knowing when it's time to take a mental health day, or knowing when it's time to go outside and take a walk, that not everything had to be, everything about their lives had to be wrapped up and tied up in their careers or their PhDs or whatever activities they were doing at the time of the interviews. We did see a few graduates talking about being able to make a positive contribution to the world around them, not to the scale that we hoped we would have seen, and we'll talk about that later in overall lessons learned. But we saw generally lots of discussion centered on what they would do next. So none of the grads, it seemed, as the time we spoke to them, even in their year 7 interviews, were content with where they were. Most of them talked about what they were going to be doing next. So overall, what were some lessons learned, we would say, from this project or from this exploration that Ala and I went on, looking specifically around how students view their roles in society after their undergrad degrees? So one of the things we realized was that maybe there needs to be more intentional connections made between degree programs and societal roles or the purposes of the degree, because it seemed the students never, only a few students explicitly spoke about seeing themselves in the broader society and things they wanted to do to have that kind of like lasting impact on their communities. It wasn't something that came up a lot. There were hints at it, so it was more implicit in some interviews, while explicit in only a few. So then what does that mean for how we define the scope and meaning of social responsibility within undergrad programs? Is this something that needs to be made more explicit? How do we, questions around how do we assist students and practitioners in developing an awareness of the broader landscape in which higher education is situated? So it's not just a degree for the sake of a degree, but what other things, like an orientation towards self? We saw a lot of orientation towards self, I would say, in both the chemistry and chemical engineering grads, but that orientation towards society was not very explicit, I would say. It also indicated that there is an importance of ethics education, not just a module that they do, but that ethics is integrated throughout degree programs, throughout the curriculum. And then we were left with a question here that I guess we want to throw out to the audience if anyone feels so inclined to respond to it. But this is something Alana really tried to wrap her head around is it even reasonable to expect to see a major shift toward a societal orientation just 3 years after completing a degree? Should this something that we try to interrogate 5 years when people are about to make a career change, 7 years? Is 3 years a reasonable timeline to expect to see this kind of thought process or this kind of orientation? Thank you for listening to our webinar. That was the end of our presentation, and we are now ready to take questions.
Thank you, Nicole and Ala. Really great talk. So I have the first question from Mike Boxall. And the question is, how much awareness did you find among engineering graduates of the greater societal responsibilities of their future roles? And a follow-up to that is, was there any observed impact of the Gen Z generation among the new graduates as compared to the previous generations?
So with the idea of awareness, there were some, I wouldn't say a majority, but there were some graduates who were aware of societal problems or challenges that we have. So sustainability and climate change came up, but they didn't necessarily connect it to their future roles. Like they didn't explicitly say that this is something themselves would work on to ensure they address it. But at least they did start drawing parallels about how their disciplinary knowledge and field in general either contributes to solving that problem or even contributes to the problem itself. So with the chemical engineering students, they talked about chemical processes, and depending on the kind of chemicals you are producing and how manufacturing works, they did elaborate that the ones who are working in those industries see the problem or see the societal problem, but they didn't talk about how they in their role going to a meeting tomorrow morning will address it per se.
Yeah, agreed. And I would even say also, we did not set up the study to look at generational differences. I'm sure they're there, but this was not something that we added to the context of the design of the study. But I do remember in the first 4-year data, so the understanding knowledge, the UXA data, not the geek one, is that we saw in some contexts more than others, an orientation towards, how their degree, and this happened, it was fascinating. This happened around the 3rd year of the data, where now they would start out very broad. Chemical engineering or chemistry allows me to do this thing. And then around the 3rd year, they would become more directed towards I want to work at a recycling plant, or I want to do something that's going to help climate change. And then whatever happened, now that they're in the work, it goes broader again. And that might just be a function of how they situate themselves in their particular jobs. But that would be interesting to see if there were any generational issues or generational impacts, but that was just not how our study was designed.
So just along the lines of the same conversation, Mike asks a follow-up, like, does this mean, and it doesn't have to be a follow-up for just the speakers. I mean, I guess others can chip in too. So does this mean, or does it suggest a need to rethink curricula to contextualize disciplines more in the context of global challenges? So that's something that kind of comes out as a question. I have another question from Josh Patel. So Josh is asking, did you see a difference in the outcomes of student outcome based on the sorts of free regimes that students were a part of? Thinking about loans versus grants, for example, as informing understanding about returns on investment on work.
If I understood, I would start with the last question about the fee regime. So we did talk about that in the undergraduate portion of the study. We explicitly asked the students if they are, for example, have taken out student loans, if that's something they worry about. And in some cases, they did elaborate, depending on their financial and background, they did elaborate if this is something they do worry about and hence need to be more focused, for example, on particular types of jobs that they are financially secure, or in other cases, this is something they worried about less because of a scholarship or because of funding from family. I'm not sure, maybe Nicole or Josh can elaborate. I'm not sure the meaning of return on investment. Is it relating the job to making sure their loan is paid? So in that case, yes, as undergraduates, but I'm not sure if once they graduated, if that came up again.
There is one participant I'm thinking about, in particular, Chloe, was from one of the US institutions, and about year 6 or 7, when asked the question again about, basically, was getting the degree what you thought it was going to be? I'm paraphrasing. And, did you get what you wanted from university? And her response in year 7 was, I have no idea. I went to get a degree because it was expected of me to get a degree. And so I think in answering the question about return on investment, that might be one of the participants where if you had asked her that exact question, do you think it was worth it? The answer might have been no. So we saw it depended on, I would say, where they were, what they were working on. Some talked, I would say generally, there's an overall thought or discussion around the degree and what they got from university being valuable for their current situation. There was some discontent around other things that they expected to have gotten from university that they didn't, but I don't think that's strange. Because if you feel like the university did not provide enough like social supports in terms of students who had more accessibility needs than others. So that came up a lot, talking about the types of student support that they didn't get, or how difficult or how long the process was. And that kind of, I would say, soured their experience on their view on the university itself. But broadly, they did talk about not just the degree, but the personal relationships and the friendships that they were able to build as a result of going to university. Earlier, I had seen Johnny Richard raise his hand. I don't know, Ashish, if you had Johnny queued up to make a comment, but I remember seeing a raised hand.
Yes, Johnny, please go ahead if you have a question.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I had a couple of questions actually. Well, loads. It's great research. Thanks very much indeed. Um, the first question was to Ala about the developing identity as an engineer, which to what extent do they see an engineer as somebody who, for example, to speak to Josh's point, earns a good wage, or do they see it as being somebody who solves societal problems, or somebody who makes bridges or weapons or plastics or whatever else their field of engineering might be. So that's one question. And sorry, I'll slip in a second one. Was speaking to Nicole's point about is 3 years the right time to ask the question? I'm almost more interested in asking a new cohort every 3 years and seeing if that pattern changes. I mentioned in the chat that there was a very interesting event yesterday run by the Royal Academy of Engineering in London about Engineers 2030, which is a new initiative that they've launched to encourage a workforce that is more society and environment focused. And there was a very inspiring third-year chemical engineering student from Birmingham University who was talking about how she had been inspired to study engineering because she wanted to, make the world a better place. And what yesterday's event was lacking was any research on understanding, is that a growing sentiment or is that a rare sentiment amongst engineering students? Was she the exception, or can we hope that she might become the rule?
Maybe I can start with addressing your first point. So I would say it's all of the above, all of the things you mentioned. So there's definitely a variation, and once one graduate or one student could have all of these things. They express, of course, they care about the job and making money. They also care about the technical side of their profession. They do want to work in a chemical processing factory, or want to make sure, like we have a student who wanted to switch to computer science. So there's a technical interest, and in some of the cases there is a social aspect that came through. So I would say it's all, but the balance between those three, let's say three things, in some cases from our perspective it's not very balanced. So you get a graduate who very interested in getting their next job and very interested in the technical knowledge, but maybe less interested in the social, or a student who worries about sustainability but then doesn't necessarily touch upon their understanding, the technical understanding of their field. So it's all of them, but where is the balance is the question we don't have an answer for yet, or I don't have an answer for.
I think your comment a lot also makes me think of how we do engineering here in the US, where the first year is very open and it's, yes, you're going to go change the world and solve problems. And then they go into their second and third year where they're just bogged down by disciplinary content and just this idea of just pass this course to move to the next year to get your degree. And so in the second and third year, you will see that shift to, I just want a job. So first year, I'm going to go change the world. And by second, third year, I just need my degree so I can get a job to get out of here. And then they go into their final year that then is like, oh, come do design and come design this amazing thing and go change the world. But at that point, it was like this, just give me my degree so I can get out.
So Nicole, that response does make me wonder about the question that you and Allah had posted on the last slide, right? Like, I mean, is it possible for any curriculum to change students' thought process or mindset in 3 years? I guess then it is, right? Like if things change so drastically, between the first and the second year or the third year, then maybe if that kind of content is put into the curriculum and it's reinforced time and again, maybe that mindset can change, right? And just based on some of the work that I have done in the past in South Africa, I can say that, I mean, students do become vocal about a certain kind of content missing or being added to later years in the engineering degree if they are used to something from earlier years. So students can then become vocal, which means that their thought process had started shifting right when the content was introduced. So if the programs are intentional about, like having a particular mindset for graduates, they can probably do it with the content modified in that way. And that kind of also aligns with the first webinar in the series by Jan last Tuesday, where each of the programs that this study kind of focuses on had a particular emphasis on what they wanted to achieve through the courses and the curriculum. So yes, but happy for others to kind of chip in here.
There was also the point I think Johnny raised about the alignment between the engineering identity and then the social problem solver identity, and the questions about if this is something we need to change in the curriculum. Yes, but I also think this is something that needs to be mirrored. You have to have the student or the person with a mindset that this is something they are willing to think about and willing to accept or becomes part of their personal identity. But also once they get to a job or get to industry, I feel, or my understanding of how things work is that on the daily task, this is something that's forgotten about. So you have this big project, and the big project gets broken down to so many pieces and so many teams. And maybe, yes, the company X has a vision of making sustainable products, but what is that translation of that very big mission or vision to the small tasks of the different teams? I think that also needs something that needs to be addressed, so that even if we change the curriculum and we have now engineering graduates who see the importance of their social responsibility and role in society, they don't end up in companies where they don't see that anymore and they cannot work with it, or they don't know how to go about it.
All right, we are still taking more questions. So please do send me your questions if you have any.
I think to Johnny's point in the comment, yes, there are institutions that are doing the society changing, but that goes to one of the first points, I think, on our last slide, where we were talking about more intentional design of degree programs geared towards the societal orientation. It does exist. And I'm sure if we were to speak to graduates from institutions or programs that had that, the responses would have been different. But at Virginia Tech, for example, just through my knowledge with another project where I'm working with second and third year instructors who teach across the College of Engineering, they talk about there's just so much content that we have to cover. We would want to do more exciting stuff and more authentic assessment. But the truth is, I know in the College of Engineering here, there's just so much content that they have to cover. They don't have time to do all of these innovative. The ones that do it very well, but for the majority, it doesn't happen.
That's something that I struggle with too. So Jan has her hand raised. Jan, do you have a question?
Oh, don't know which way I'm looking. No, it's not so much a question. I just wanted to, the point that Johnny raised was so interesting. And I suppose working on the project, there were two things that worried us about this, that you could get these students with these amazing commitments about change, and that our worry was that we teach it out of them. And part of that is linked to the point that Nicole just made about this crowded curriculum. So even where you have things that are designed to really foster that connection to society, unless you have time to think about that, and for it not to just be a technocratic exchange, then it's not going to happen. And I think, you know, our worry is not students coming in with these great aspirations. The worry is them staying and nurturing that commitment over the degree.
So I have a question for both of you, Nicole and La. And the question is, like, so did you see any shift? And if you looked at that piece of the data, like, did you see any shift in how students think about the society and the responsibility they have toward the society between when they were in the final year, almost graduating, and now that's like 2 years post graduation when they are in the workforce or, you know, doing things after their undergraduate degree? Was there a shift?
I would hesitate to say yes. I think more than the actual, I don't think so. I think the time span was very short. I think more than a shift, we just saw maybe differences in the type of conversations that came up in the interviews. So as Nicole mentioned, for example, the students, sorry, the graduates talked about what's next for them, and in the engineering data, there were a couple of graduates who were between jobs or get worried about promotion for their next career step, and less so there was shift in the type of content we saw in the interviews, but I wouldn't say a shift in that wouldn't necessarily reflect a shift in their identities or in their perceptions.
I think the one time, maybe they're in other transcripts, but the one that really stood out to me, I mentioned on the slide, was Mason. He had taken a gap year, and in that gap year, he was like working in some after school, high school program. And so by the time he got interviewed in year 6 or 7, talked about how being able to step away from it and being in this different space, how his perceptions on even what he wanted to do next change. And so I think there may have been other, maybe not a major shift, but there may have been more subtle types of changes. And it either had to do with, like when I looked at the chemistry data, it either had to do with if they had changed like a role, or if they shifted disciplines altogether. So if they were a chemistry and now was doing medicine, or now was doing engineering, or had changed jobs between year 5 and 7, those were the times when you would see like them starting to see, well, you know, it's not just chemistry, but it is situated in this bigger landscape. It's not just my job, it's situated in this bigger system. So it happened to some degree, I would say. But it was like if the same in Chloe's case, where she went from the undergrad right into the PhD program, like Chloe's perceptions, I would say, will be different from someone like Mason, who took a year off to go do something else and was now coming back, making the choice to come back to get another degree at the same institution.
So there's some conversation between Paul and Mike in the chat. So Paul, kind of responding to Johnny, said, or Paul, do you want to say that, like, instead of me reading out what you've said?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't expecting that. Yeah, so I mean, I'm only agreeing with Nicole and La as always. But you know, just that, you know, it is really fascinating in our data that particularly in South Africa, I think, which I don't think Nicole and La emphasised, but when they come in the first year, lots of enthusiasm, particularly for projects like desalination. Water shortage is a major issue in South Africa. They want to solve that issue. They're not going into mining, and then they graduate and they go into mining. And I think, you know, my sense, as I've just said in the chat, is that it's partly because there's no structures in society to support them with those ideas once they graduate. And it's also, Lewis Elton used to talk about putting new lecturers on teacher training courses and expecting them to transform their departments. And he called this the "where there is death, there is hope" strategy of change, that you get new people in and they'll change everything. And it never, ever works, you know, because basically the new people become like the old people, because that's where the power and the prestige is. So in exactly the same way, expecting new graduates in chemistry or engineering to transform society will only ever fail unless we develop wider structures that enable them to create relationships and networks that actually build with people established in the field, with non-graduates. You know, that's the only way in which, you know, that can really work. Anyway, that's quite enough for me.
Sorry, Paul, for putting on the spot. All right, so any more questions? We have about 8 more minutes.
Johnny's hand is raised.
Oh, Jan. Let's see.
Johnny.
Oh, Johnny.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I wanted to come back again, and I agree entirely with Paul, and again referencing yesterday's RANG event, which was very pertinent to this. There was discussion of a sort of bottleneck as students start off all idealistic, and also senior engineers can be all idealistic once they've got to a certain level of seniority, but there's a bottleneck in between where you just have to do the job and get the kids off to school and pay the mortgage and things like that, and so in that area, that's when people lose sight of their grander ambitions and these principles that they want to maintain. So what are the structures that we can put in place to support that continued ideological approach, or if ideological is perhaps the wrong word, principled approach. And I think that the way that is developed is by changing education, because every time you change education, you change a new cohort, and you create a new cohort of engineers who go in with a different attitude to ethics or a different attitude to sustainability, and they become the middle managers, and hopefully the generation that follows them is a little bit more able with each increasing generation to feel that they can, for example, be a whistleblower if they feel a project is not safe, or if they feel a project is environmentally damaging. They can speak up and recognize that that's part of being a good engineer. Sorry, I'm speaking about engineering because, as you can see, oh, that's right, that's my job rather than chemistry, but the same no doubt applies. And yeah, I feel bad about this, but I'm about to do a little plug, which is the Engineering Professors Council has created an ethics toolkit, which is a whole raft of resources, case studies, and so on, which support the embedding and interweaving of ethics into a crowded curriculum. We recognize the current curriculum is very crowded. So how do you teach these things more effectively by having case studies and problem-based learning that teaches the ethics and the sustainability at the same time as teaching the technical content. And yeah, both of those toolkits can be found on the link I posted in the chat, and they are free to use for everybody. That's why I feel a little more able to make a plug.
Thanks, Johnny. So just kind of responding to one of the comments that came from you, Johnny, about, like the crowded curriculum that kind of ties with what Nicole said about her experiences of working with second and third year instructors. So it's quite interesting, right? Like that raises the question around like, what is the purpose of an engineering or a STEM degree or any higher education undergraduate degree, right? Like, is it like expected to teach a bunch of content to students, or is it expected to do something else, right? And I personally tend to lean on the side of, okay, like let's teach students how to learn. And that's something that came up in the second webinar last week on this series around, okay, so one of the values of a higher education degree is that it teaches students, it gives student the tool to attain mastery into something that they don't know much about, right? So is putting in more content into the curriculum a way to go about doing that, right? Or is that something else? Like, do we need to focus on a little bit less curriculum and more on skills that graduates can use going forward in the future and learn more things if the need is? Just a food for thought. So that being said, if there's any other question or comment, Renee has a comment saying like the employment situation in South Africa also leads to the kinds of jobs that STEM graduates or any graduate kind of land up with. And I think that's in context of the conversation around how there isn't a lot of shift or, like that bottleneck years of just getting your job done kind of comes from. So that being said, if there's any other question, please let me know. We still have a minute to go. Nope, I don't see any question coming in. So thank you everyone for being here. It was a pleasure to hear the speakers talk. Just a quick reminder, the fourth and the final webinar for this series is going to be on Thursday, that is day after tomorrow, by Paul Ashwin and Jenny Case. And we hope to see everyone there. Once again, many thanks to Nicole and Allah for this interesting talk and everyone else who contributed through conversations. Have a great rest of your day or evening.